Okay everybody, welcome back to Law Hero. My name is Jen and I make videos about the law. Today is a good one, I think, and it's for me and you, it's for all of us. And it's important because, yeah, I've just put down a week where, I've had a bit of imposter syndrome, I've had some, thinking I'm the worst. And that's okay, we all go through that. Especially when, like for me, I'm 3 years qualified and yeah, like it doesn't get any easier. Every single day you feel inadequate. A lot of the time it's just your perfectionism coming out, but especially we'll say if you go head to head with other lawyers, you kind of realize, okay, I have a knowledge gap here. But it's just really important to learn from those people, and that's like one of my tips on how to be an intelligent lawyer. Like we'll say, actually, the one big tip, and it's something I used to do when I was a trainee, is write down what's happening on a transaction. And if there's a markup, like we'll say if there's some agreement that's gone a version up, look at the red line, look at what changes have been made. And the best trainees I know, they absorb what the amendments were, because that is the negotiation in practice. And for me, like when I go up a version and I'm amending stuff, you have to be, obviously you have to have a keen eye for detail, but you also need to project the commercial reality into the worst case scenario. So what do I mean by that? So for example, data is the hot commodity at the moment, and we saw last week like the HSE had a data breach, which has caused massive disruption to how they do their work. So if you think of it like this, you can legislate in an agreement around liability. Okay, you can say the liability will be 200% of the fees owed under an agreement. Okay. The problem with that is, in reality, we'll say if the fees owed are 100,000, so 200% is obviously 200,000. For a data breach like the one the HSE had, which is in the millions, if you want to quantify it in monetary terms, it'd be in millions, because the potential loss of data means they could get a DPC fine. They also have downtime because their employees aren't working, and they have commitments or service levels with other organizations that they have to fulfill. So like the monetary, you can't, in an agreement you will seek to cap liability, but in reality if something like that is the worst case scenario, you have a data breach that leads to that kind of disruption, you can put a price on that. So it is unfair to put the worst case scenario on your counterparty. And these are the kind of things I want you guys to be looking at, like especially in any type of agreement that you're looking at the big ticket clauses like term termination, liability. Those to me would be the three most important ones. And it's this kind of thinking that makes you intelligent as a young lawyer, and you have to understand that there's a whole framework through which all of this works. So yes, you have an agreement between the parties, but outside the agreement is the commercial reality of the world. And when we try and see, do people have commercial acumen, or when people ask in job interview around their commercial awareness, that's what it is. So like even for us at 3 years PQE, our commercial awareness is around, okay, we know that, for example, the Data Protection Commissioner for a GDPR breach will put in 4% of your turnover. Okay, so then you think of, okay, what's our turnover, what's their turnover, that's the max possible fine. But in all reality, they're not going to get that. It's only like a Facebook or a Google who's going to get that 4% fine. So like that's commercial awareness. You know what's out there, you know what other people are doing. Like, for example, that it's 1 times the fees owed or twice the fees that are owed when it comes to a liability clause, because you've heard other people do that. That's all commercial awareness. So I think commercial awareness is a lot more than knowing what's going on in the Financial Times. I think it does encompass reading legal articles, legal updates, researching like around liability clause, for example, what is acceptable when it comes to GDPR, that kind of thing. Like those are very practical things, because there's a GDPR liability clause now in every single agreement, because that's where the breach is. Like if you're any type of business, you're going to have data flow. So those kind of things are really important. Say your success can never be greater than your level of thinking. So if you think about it like this, if your awareness of your industry isn't elevated, we'll say on a high level, like we'll say for me in the motor industry, if I don't have an awareness of the issues that's in the motor industry, that won't trickle down to what I'm doing day to day. So you need to understand that you need to have a broad awareness of what's going on in your industry in order to implement the day-to-day stuff. The next point I'm going to use is all things begin with wondering, and that comes from Socrates. And if I ever get a dog, I'm going to call him Socrates. But it's very, very important to ask why people are doing things. And sometimes, even though I know the answer, I'm going to ask my counterparty, like, why did you put in that clause? So yeah, you need to be committed to lifelong learning. Like, you need to get in your head that the whole thing is a process. You're building it up all the time, and that like every day you're going to learn something new. You need to park your ego big time, because ego is really not going to help you. I used to have this thing where if I sent out a document and it came back with a load of markup, I was like, oh, I don't think I'm intelligent. But now I'm just like, oh, thanks for catching that. I'm like, yeah, it's a collaborative thing. We're working together. I want you to catch all my mistakes, and I'm going to try my best to catch yours. It's not a competitive thing anymore. Like, it really isn't. At the start it was for me because I had a big ego, but now it's not. I just want to protect the business I'm working for. So yeah, the other thing I do as well is I'll sleep on something. So I'll work on something all day and I will ask for permission. I'll be like, can I just sleep on this? And then I'll just leave some lucid dreaming or whatever, sort out some outstanding problems. So like, once I've done something, I'll be like, okay, these are the outstanding points, and I'll just literally let my subconscious, I know it sounds very wishy-washy, but I'll let it stew over it. And then the next day when I come back to it, usually the problem is sorted, or my brain is giving me a trigger to go and ask someone, or I've had an idea that will remedy it in a more organic way than if I just sat there and tried to solve the problem coldly and didn't give it time. So I find sleeping on it really helpful. I've made lots of videos on how to understand the mind. I think if you understand that your brain's always looking for shortcuts, then you'll actually be able to short circuit that reflex. So what I mean by that is, like, the nature of humans is that we're always looking for shortcuts. So if you can somehow force yourself to not fall into that trap, your work product is going to be much better, because people, like, even if you do get much better at drafting, or you do get much better at spotting patterns, because you didn't take the shortcuts at the start, it's hardwired in you how to do things properly, and it becomes much, much easier. If you are a shortcut person from the very, very beginning, and what I mean by that is, you're given a task and you do it the quickest way possible and you learn nothing from it. Okay, you get kudos for doing it properly, but you learn nothing. Sometimes, for example, if you're given a task to draft something, take your time and try, and like, don't worry about getting it. Like, obviously you have to get it to the person within a certain deadline, but don't be too hung up on the deadline, because at the end of the day, it's your own training and it's your learning. And as I said, like, your success will never be higher than how much you know. So it is actually worth putting in the time, being like, okay, like, what am I actually doing? Or am I just throwing back something to that person because I'm trying to do things quickly? Like, by the way, this is all feedback I got as a trainee, so I'm just trying to package it and pass it on to you. So yeah, and that's why I think, for example, Stoicism has really helped me, even in drafting, because in drafting you go to the worst case scenario, and this is called like inversion thinking, whereby you reverse engineer from the worst case scenario. So like, as I said earlier, like you have a data breach. That is the worst case scenario, but it did happen to the HSE recently. So now we all have immediacy bias. So all lawyers at the moment have immediacy bias. We're like, oh, look what just happened to the HSE. So in the next agreement we do, we'll focus a little bit more around the data breach element, because we're like, this just happened and it's, high profile in the media. Whereas we'll say, like, if you live in an area where someone was just kidnapped, you're going to be a little bit more on edge because of the immediacy bias. You're like, oh, well, someone just got kidnapped here, maybe I'm next, which is, it sounds logical when you say it, but it's an absolute fallacy. There's no logic in it whatsoever. So what the brain does is just make a shortcut and go, okay, because that person got taken, so will I. That's worst case. It's not only worst case scenario, it's making a shortcut of logic, and it's also putting you in a state of distress, which is just unnecessary. It's like when country people go to Dublin for the first time and everyone's like, be careful you don't get robbed, because they just heard it somewhere. It's like a logical fallacy. So what I've written down here is try to consistently not be stupid. So rather than trying to look intelligent, the best thing you can do is try and minimize your mistakes. So again, I'll use the example of agreement. When you're going down through the agreement, you try and minimize your mistakes by, when you're reading down through every sentence, questioning, is this relevant? What's the worst case scenario? If I was somebody else outside of my organization or a judge, I always think of myself as a judge, how would I interpret this sentence? And you become naturally intelligent the less mistakes you make. You can also be mindful, that helps. I had a video on how not to make mistakes. If you go to my playlist, you'll see it there recently, and I think that really helps. Because intelligence is ultimately dangerous. If you think you're intelligent, that is dangerous. The next point I have written down is don't get too caught up in form, okay? Worry more about function. Think of the suitcase and the car. Before that, people worried too much about form and were unable to see that in another context, putting wheels on both a suitcase and under a horse was an easier way. And I love this because I think we're very superficial beings. We don't really look at context, because again, we're always trying to short circuit. So we'll say in the example of putting wheels under a suitcase and making a rolly case, that was too much of a leap for the human brain. It took a very special human brain to say, no, okay, even though the function of the suitcase and the wheels are very different, when they're combined, they create something very useful. And only that person could see the use at the time they invented it. It's a bit like with PayPal, and I'm thinking of Elon Musk. I'm a big fan of his. I know some people have issues around his social awkwardness and stuff, but I think he's one of those people who sees the functionality and use of something before the rest of us do. And those people are very special, and he's one of those people who thinks from a first principles framework, which is from physics, which is, okay, what use is this? Like, he's always looking at functionality and use rather than the form. And he has had problems with Tesla, for example. The boots, they let in water, but it doesn't matter because they were still the first big en masse electrical vehicle producer. So you might be like, oh, but he's not a car manufacturer, he's an engineer. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the form is, as long as it functions. And I think that's the point people miss out a lot. So, lots of people crave, aesthetically pleasing, whether it's on Twitter, you have 140 characters? I don't know, I've never been on Twitter, but that never appealed to me, because for me, I felt that was form over functionality, in that people want short bite-sized information because their brain is looking for an easy win, a quick shot of dopamine. But in my opinion, that's not healthy. If you're trying to explain something, you need to go through the nuances. I know that like for small arguments or small statements, like somebody scored a goal, you can just go, yay, 1-0 to Ireland. And I think that's what Twitter should be for. It shouldn't be for the wokevists. It shouldn't be for discussing big social issues. It shouldn't be for apologies, because all of those things are multi-layered. And what you're doing with a tweet is you're looking for a short way to get dopamine, and it's because you favor form over functionality. The next one is look to cause and effective relationships, and this is what Steve Jobs always said around pattern spotting. So, for example, using the wheel on HP printers for the iPod, look for similar patterns in all areas of your work, and also look cross industry. So don't be just interested in your own industry. Understand manufacturing, understand retail, understand education, infrastructure, health, all different areas, and how they all interact will elevate your level of thinking. Do not multitask, because when you multitask, you suffer from switching between activities, and the fatigue and the focus that is lost between switching between activities, especially when there's high brain power involved, as in you need to really focus. For menial tasks like, I don't know, watching a YouTube video while you do the washing up, you can totally multitask in that. But when you're doing work that's, for example, like studying or doing law, anything law related, do not multitask. And then the last one comes from Leonardo da Vinci, and his principle of life was the curious approach, asking how come, testing knowledge, looking for continuous refinement, a balance between science and art, which is yin and yang in my opinion, cultivation of grace in the mind and body, systematic thinking, which comes back to the first principles thinking, understanding that all phenomena are connected, and this is really important for abstract thinkers. Using mind mapping can be helped by journaling. And mind mapping is a great way of figuring out processes, and it's something I do a lot to try and understand new concepts. So if I read something in a book, I'll often go to my journal afterwards and try and see, can I recollect it in my own words through a mind map. That really helps. So, I do it a lot of the time with shapes in Microsoft Word. That really helps. You can just do it as well with like a circle and lines coming out of it. It helps very much for recalling things. And because we're visual creatures, we can recall things much, much better if they're in a visual sense. So yeah, those are some of my tips on how to be a more intelligent lawyer. I hope you learned something from it. It's a little bit philosophical, but it's also mixed with practical, so that's totally my vibe. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.